Hey everybody, it's Michael Martin. Thanks for being here. Just got back from Toronto. Was with JC and Straza and all my buddies and Chicago Sean and Mary and Spencer, and it was a good time. Saw a lot of people, a lot of good friends. Great discussions on stocks and how to trade. One of the newer guys pulled me aside, and he's going through another training program that's more in the day trading space. He said, what would you do if you were starting all over again? And I always kind of hate these questions because I'm a relic compared to it's a completely different world right now. So what would the hopefully more mature and someone who's got aged wisdom, what would I look at? What would I do if I had the same level of liquidity and, the same, like I got to trade my way out of financial despair. And it's funny, I was telling him a story that when I was in grade school, we didn't have a lot of money, and we didn't also have a school that had hot lunches. Hot lunch was like on Wednesday, and what they would do is they'd cook hot dogs, and we could get like a hot dog. That was hot lunch once a week. And it was probably like 50 cents or something ridiculous. And that was like a big treat. Then, McDonald's would come over and or maybe they'd get large pizza. We'd get a slice or two or something like that. But there was no cafeteria style. There was a cafeteria there, but it wasn't kind of manned with anybody, for example. And so for the other 4 days, I'd have to bring my lunch, and I can remember literally having peanut butter and margarine as my sandwich to bring, and we could get milk at the school. So I always go back and think about like what was the motivating factor. Like you need to have a motivating factor. And my parents were amazing. They were my best friends. They gave us everything they could, my sister and me. And um, so at the end of the day, I think what I would do is I would make sure I have a full understanding of leverage. I did, but it was an innate understanding. Obviously the sword cuts both ways. Um, I could afford now in today's environment to be much more active and take paper cut hair losses where, because of the commissions involved when I started, I had to be a much better timer of the market and also be mindful that every time I did a transaction, I was at least in a 1% drawdown via the trade. Given the bid-ask spread and the commissions involved, it was probably 1.5 to 2% for futures. But I had 5K, which is about 13,000 in today's dollars, and I was trading it, I guess, on a notional value that was probably somewhere between 25 and 50,000 because I was doing stocks and futures, at the same time, and I was leveraging my account. I was buying into winners. I think I would have accelerated and done that faster. I was much more measured when I was younger, just again, because of the commissions. Now there's virtually no commissions compared to what it was like. They're down 95, sometimes 100%. So I would really do a deep dive on leverage and mark my positions to the market, put them on a spreadsheet. Now you have all these tools that you can use, but I think doing it by hand, which is how I did it, meant a lot. And I would definitely kind of storyboard trades and say, okay, if I caught this trade in cotton or this trade in Wendy's and I took it home with me, what would be the drawdown that I would have to endure in order to kind of stay in the position? Because again, in those days, the commissions were so high, I couldn't let a 50-cent pullback on me psych me out of a trade that was otherwise kind of still going. So I also looked at what I didn't know then, but are what now people refer to as continuation patterns. Because you can have an initial breakout, and then after the initial breakout, or if you're looking at stage analysis, or Victor Sperando calls it the 1, 2, 3 reversal. You have bases within the stages, and then you have continuation patterns. That didn't really exist when I started, so I'm pretty sure I would look and say, okay, this is a continuation pattern. It's, we can put the punt team on the field, but let's do a fake punt and make it an offensive play. Fake punt, run right, or some kind of a dump pass for a 2 or 3 yard gain, get the first down and keep kind of the offense moving down the field. That was trickier to do then because there wasn't the level of community, which, again, having just come back from Toronto and Portfolio Accelerator, I would definitely make sure that I'm in a community of like-minded people, not a bunch of chatterboxes, um, but people who have a similar trading strategy and a typical mindset on abundance. That's the key part right there. Most of the folks that I have in my world are thinking really big, like how can we 10x things? Or they're in business and they're looking to grow a gigantic company. Um, that I did naturally, and just because I kind of had to. We were so broke. So I had to think like, and this is, I know it's going to sound crazy, but how could I take the 25K and turn it into 25K? Because I could see enough in the chart books. I used to get the CRT mailed to me, and then in the office they had technical analysis, and I would be like, okay, what did the person have to think about beforehand to get into that trade? And then what would they had to have endured emotionally and financially while they were in that trade, right? In order to stay with the trade to make as much money as possible. Because again, for me, buying and selling was going to take a lot of commission out of my account, which was I was very sensitive to. So um, focusing on one instrument and not stock index futures. The reason being, I think, and this is where this community kind of fails at it, is that they come in every day and they kind of think like, okay, what is the Johnny McGorry with the market? And my thought is like, okay, what can you do if you have to read more, I think is what I'm getting at. To be a really good stock index futures trader, I don't think it's about chart overlays. I think you need to understand the nature of risk, the nature of leverage. What can you take home? What can you take home over the weekend versus what can you take home overnight during the week? But also what really moves markets so that you don't have to be in and out and in and out and in and out. Like learn to understand what, because risk isn't necessarily bad, right? Any more than fire. You just need to be able to control it. So, um, if I was in stock index futures, which I might look at again because commissions are zero, and the contract, the E-mini, which kind of was invented while I was trading, like 6-7 years into the business, it cut the Big Daddy it used to be $500 a point. So it was an institutional product. Then they said, okay, we're going to create the E-mini with the advent of the internet and online trading, and then we're going to cut that to 1/10 the size. And now we can let all the day traders, trade their hearts out. My take on that would be, let's think about the longer term moves. Where are you gonna, where can you add to your winners? Where can you know where the risk is? Where would you get out? But also what I would do is I would read like Barron's on the weekends, and I would read The Economist every week to know where the US is in the grand scheme of things, as opposed to coming in every morning and just trying to figure it out that day. I think that can be done, but I think it's a big disadvantage to not have a nice understanding of where we are and where the opportunity is, because institutions can move 8-9 figures of capital with the push of a button. And you have to follow, where the herd is going if you want liquidity, right? And if you want in on the action, because, institutions leave footprints when they trade, and you have to make sure that, you're on the right side of that. That doesn't mean by any stretch of the imagination, though, that you have to go home flat every day. I know some of you are at these firms, or you're doing these challenges, and they get all the stupid rules. I'm talking about, what do you really want to do with your money, right? So, position sizing, and then not necessarily worrying about any one particular trade, but knowing that your behavior predicts where you end up in life. And then also think about where, where can you add or remove risk? Now, if you're underfunded, that's a big problem. So, tell me to shut up and trade MNQs every day. I'm thinking about, again, if I had the same mindset that I needed to take the equivalent of, 13K in today's dollars and multiply that fivefold to give myself some breathing room. The idea wasn't that I didn't have to keep turning over my money. I think that's a bit of a fallacy. I think if you're in a good move, that thing is going to take care of a lot of problems for you early on, right? But no one talks about that because, they have to stick to their agenda that, you have to keep your money moving. I think there's nuances to that, right? There's nuances because if you're in the middle of a bull move that's going to take 400 or 500 points, you know, on the S&P, you know, you might as well stay with it for as long as you possibly can, given what your parameters for risk management are. Um, you have to have the funding for that, of course. We didn't have the E-mini, so it wasn't an issue. I had to choose these sleepy little contracts that would move, but where I could also take advantage of the leverage. Two, I would also understand that the you know concept of seasonality. There's earning seasons for stock, but with commodities, especially the physical commodities, you have crop years and things like that. It wouldn't occur to me to even think about that when I was, walking in the front door. Again, because I was trying to work as a financial advisor, which I didn't care for, but it was my way into the business. Again, there was no internet, there was no other way to trade. I wouldn't have had enough money to get anyone's attention to be able to open up a brokerage account if I didn't join the business. So there was a lot of a method to my madness in there. Um, I would master leverage. I would kind of stay where the action is. In the early days, there was this whole concept of Wintel, right? Because you had the Clone Wars, you had IBM, which was the big PC maker at the time, and then you had Windows or DOS-based machines like Dell or Hewlett Packard, or what was the other one? Gateway. Um, so there was a whole bunch of what they called IBM clones that ran on MS-DOS or Windows eventually, that were a little bit more affordable because you weren't paying for the IBM brand. And that became a big theme, like the I used to say Wintel, Windows with Intel chips were going to power the big boom. Of course, Bill Gates and Paul Allen, rest his soul, capitalized on all of that. So that was kind of like a theme that you could jump on board. Apple Computer, as it was called, was really a one-trick pony. It was pre-Mac. They made good machines. I had used them for various student products. I can remember the stock being $6. Um, but I would stick where the action is and where the liquidity is, because then you can, again, if you have a clear understanding of leverage, you'll be able to move ample amounts of size. In today's day and age, I would have accelerated my education on options a lot sooner. In those days, it was very tricky. Again, I had to kind of wear it in my day, Clark Kent kind of a job. I had to be a financial advisor and try to hit all those goals. So trying to learn options from an unsophisticated crowd with imperfect and incomplete information was just impossible. Nowadays, there's so much out there and there's so many people doing it well. It's a lot easier to get access to that information. So I think I would have gotten closer to trading options much, much sooner than I did, which was probably at least 10 years into what I was doing, because I had a knack for futures. I understood it because I grew up in the crop year. I understood, you know, how you plant, you grow, you harvest, and you prepare for the next season. I understood crop rotation because, New York is a big dairy state. There's a lot of farming going on there. And so I understood that because I those were jobs I had as a kid. And that was just dumb luck. Um, so I amplified that. I would probably do that again in today's day and age. I'd get to options a lot sooner than I did. And I would focus on one thing, meaning one particular vehicle. Again, extra stock index futures. I would probably come back to that at a later time, just because on any given day, it's tricky. You have to do a lot of reading. Um, I never did anything based on guesswork or hunches. That's where my thing came in. So I I didn't just trade also with technical analysis. I needed to understand why the trade was setting up the way it was, because yes, you can have technical breakouts and you can have moving average crossovers or what have you, but in order to be involved in sustained moves, the fundamentals have to be there as well. Now, lucky for me, I had a subscription to The Economist, and I read mostly because I was interested in what was going on in the world. It was there's no internet. Where you're going to get that information? It wasn't in the New York Daily News. It wasn't in the Post, and it wasn't in the Gannett papers that were there. That was all local, stuff. New York Times would have some stuff, but it kind of, like today, still comes in with a heavy slant, which is, my New York Times right now is so that I could do the games, pretty much, the pips and the crossword puzzle and all that kind of stuff. The news reporting is a lot like what you see in late night TV. It's too biased anymore. So those are some of the things that come to mind. How I would exactly do it, I don't know. But those are the things that I think would be much more prevalent in my life. I would also be mindful that overtrading is a real thing. For me, I was handcuffed because of the commissions, but unless you're trained, I wouldn't be doing 10 or 20 trades a day, because then it looks like you don't know what you're doing, right? Now, as you learn more and you want to keep your losses small, and again, you're trained and you're scalping, this is a strategy, right, that requires or can involve a lot more activity. Having said that, I would set blinders or guidelines on my trading account, because everything is a free-for-all. You can use much more leverage right now intraday. Some of these platforms let you trade 5 or 6 to 1. I don't know that's a good thing. And with the commissions being low to very low to nothing, it can induce you to do lots of transactions. So I think I would also say to myself, given my rather limited capital, because I still, with the level of money that I have, I would still need to pretty much double my account to get past whatever these PDT rules, right? Because I'm at about 13K adjusting from dollars at different periods. I'm still well below PDT, which I think is 25K. So I know I would have definitely looked at futures to leverage my account as best I could. But I think what I would also do is have a full command of, like, okay, what's my portfolio heat, and also give myself a diet of trades and say, if I'm going to put on these trades, I'm limiting myself to, 2 trades a day. And by 2 trades, I mean 2 round turns. I'm going to get in. If I get stopped, that's 1 full trade. I'm allowed 1 more. And I know some people say, okay, I get $500 a day risk limit. So what's my A setup? What's my B setup? What's my C setup? This is very intense, to learn that on your own. So I really only had 1 setup. And I guess you would call that an A setup. It didn't feel like an A setup when I was doing it, but I would say, okay, here's my daily limit on what I'm willing to look at and to lose, which would probably be high because I had an appetite for risk. It didn't bother me. I was also, so I would probably be at like 1 or 2%, probably 2% a day, which by many standards is insane. But that was my tolerance for risk. I also knew that, with my 5K, I could add between 5 and 10% of that every month. Having earned that from my paycheck, I could dump that back into my account. So if I had a 5% drawdown, I could annul that by adding money back to my account and kind of keeping things close to, 5K. So if I did get out flat and get knocked out, the drawdown would be minimalized because I could add money back in. That was my commitment to learn my craft. It also did something to me psychologically to understand that the drawdowns weren't going to have that type of impact on me, because I knew there was intuitively that, losing money is it helps shape you, and small losses are actually a huge part of your system. They're not anything to be frowned upon. You want to invite lots of small losses. What you want to avoid are the bigger losses, because you're like, I'm kind of reluctant to take my stop here. It's Wendy's. How bad could it be? Dave Thomas was still alive. That kind of stuff will get you killed. But I would definitely think about, position sizing. Where's the action? Stick with the action. Move my protective stop. Look to know where to add. Because really, the good news about that is that you get about 1 or 2 moves a year, and they can really make your whole year. And you've seen people do it, right? Um, but then going back to the risk management thing is it wouldn't just be a dollar amount, it would be a number of trades. So that this way, I would have a diet of risk. Say, okay, I got 5K, I'm risking, you know, 2% of my account in terms of losses. Your timing has to be phenomenal. And Paul Tudor Jones had said something like that too. Like, what's your daily risk limit? What's your weekly risk limit? And then what's your monthly risk limit? And I'm going to come back to that in a minute because I use that a lot, even when I went out on my own. And then I want to talk about preparation. You know, um, I've always said good trading it happens between 5 and 8 o'clock at night Eastern, and there's a lot of wisdom in that. So what you can do is like say it's Friday, market closes at 4 Eastern. You can do a post-mortem and a recap on your own work right then and there when it's fresh in your mind. That's what I used to do. Everyone else would be going to Spring Lake or the Jersey Shore or going out to the Hamptons or Cape Cod or just going out and chilling. And I wanted to do a review so that I knew where I stood and that I also could be very, very objective um, while everything was fresh in my mind. Then do a post-mortem, and then I was very brutal on myself. This trade was good. This trade wasn't good. Did I stick to my rules? But then also I would look and say, okay, here's the week. Because one of the things that the firm did is they would go on the Squawk Box and say, here's where everyone's positioned around the firm, this, that, or the other thing. And I'd be like, wait a second, Sun Microsystems, how did I miss that move? Like, that's right under everybody's nose. So I also, was measuring like, how could I cast my net? Now we have screeners and all this and that. Back then we didn't have them. So I would be like, okay, I'm reading a lot as much as I possibly can. How did these things miss my radar? How did I miss them? Because it's my responsibility. And then try to always make adjustments then to my own screening, which I had to do manually, which sucked. Took a lot of time. Measure my success. Look at what was setting up. How did the market, close? I was very famous for, and I still do this, is I initiate positions on Friday's close. Some of you look at me like, you smoking crack, homie. There's a lot of wisdom in that. So if you look at see how did things trade throughout the week and they close strong on Friday, before you say you're crazy, what's Monday's open look like? Right? So I, thank God, understood the math and I could see that and I could study that behavior. It's not a chart pattern per se, but it's human behavior. You have to remember, humans make the charts, not the companies. Companies make fundamentals. Human beings create the charts. And that's a bit, I don't know if that's a pun, because in those days we had to make them by hand, but it's human behavior that gives you the open, high, low, close. Then later, like a few years later, people started looking at candlesticks, but those didn't become popular until the internet boom, when everyone had computers and they could doctor up things on their charts. But that you didn't log into an account and have 45 different ways to close, open to close, OHLC bars. You had OHLC, and that was that. That's what every chart looked like. Or they would do like line charts, which were virtually useless for trading. But I would look and say, okay, what did I miss? What's the opportunity cost of how much I missed? Because that was real money that I didn't have, and that would motivate me to be like, I'm a broke ass bitch, and how do I miss something that was right underneath my nose? And then, okay, what positions do I have? What ones can I initiate come Monday if I couldn't initiate them on Friday? And then lock that in, usually by 6, 7, 8 o'clock on Friday. I wasn't the best boyfriend. Then obviously read Barron's on Saturday. Try to catch up with other reading and The Economist and stuff. Friday, Saturday, then Sunday. Sunday night, review everything again for Monday and just make sure, which was a little harder because in those days, again, I was doing my own charts. I couldn't go home and log into the computer because there wasn't one. There wasn't an internet. So I had to pack up a ton of crap, 12 a foot of paperwork to bring home to read through and all that. So I would definitely keep and focus on as much preparation as possible. And, obviously, given the life that I've led, spent a lot of time in keeping my mental game sharp. I kind of intuitively always did that, but I would probably get better at planning things because I could be more efficient with my time. Everything back then was so labor intensive, which meant time. And I always made a point of saying, like, I want to stop exchanging my time for money. And I remember thinking, like, okay, if I had $1 million and the money market was paying, 4%, whatever, 5%, that's 60, 50K a year. So 4,000 a month. And I was paying 1,000. Thank God I didn't have a lot of student loans, but I had 1,000 a month to pay back student loans, and I had 1,300 a month rent in New York City. Now it's 4 times that, 3 times that anyway, depends where you live. Um, and I could live with passive income. That was kind of what I was thinking. Like, what could I do to get my money to work for me so that I could just go do whatever I wanted to do, and my money would be bringing money, cash flow to me. So I thought, like, man, I got to think of a plan to grow my account. So I let go of worrying about any one particular trade. In the near term, I was concerned from the commission standpoint, but I was always thinking like a position trader, like, how could I get onto this move and keep Wendy's from like 16 to 25 or $30 a share and be as fully loaded as possible. I just knew that intuitively because, again, being very, very active, it would feel good to have lots of winning trades, and you have to have winning trades net of your losing trades. But I kind of borrowed, well, I didn't borrow because I didn't know him at the time, but I've heard Stan Druckenmiller say he puts his eggs in just, a few. He does kind of put all his eggs in one basket, maybe 2 or 3 of them. And then he said he watches the basket very closely. I kind of had to do that because I didn't have any, it made no sense to try to diversify 5K. What was I going to do with making, in those days, the total return on the S&P was 12.25%. Now it's like 9.8. So what am I going to do with that, growing my money 10% a year? Take me 7 years to double my account. I have that kind of time. So the due diligence, the research, the preparation, I always knew that, we kind of had to read Think and Grow Rich was a required book. There was actually I was quizzed on this. The branch manager when he was an old E.F. Hutton guy. There's a lot of old Hutton guys, and coincidentally, guys from Hayden Stone, which is where Ed and Michael and Amos Hofstetter had worked. That's in the that office was in the GM building, which is like 59th Street and Fifth Avenue. There's an Apple store now downstairs across from the plaza, but that's where their office was. That's where my first interview was, but to get into the training program. Isn't that kind of crazy that I was interviewing it inside the same building where, at least 2 of my mentors had worked, before they found their way to Commodities Corporation. Think and Grow Rich. There was obviously The Art of War. In terms of preparation, that book is amazing. Victorious warriors first win, then seek battle. So I spent a lot of time to try to be mentally and emotionally prepared for the rigors of trading. When they didn't have like the kind of coaches like me around, they didn't help me with my inner game. I had to do that all by myself. There wasn't there weren't really books on that kind of stuff, because you got to remember the first Market Wizards book was just coming out. So I would spend, but I also, coming through this window of time, I remember the guy who interviewed me, his name was Ray. And I guess he wanted to put me to the test. So he kept asking me about all these books on economics or whatever. And I don't know if he thought I was lying to him or BSing him or whatever. I mean, he asked me about, the theory of the leisure class. And I was like, oh, yeah, Thorstein Veblen. And he looked at me like I had said the F-bomb and the N-word in one sentence. And I was like, what? And he's like, you're the only person who's ever gotten the question right. I said, well, I had to read that book for school, and write papers on it. And the idea behind that book, Theory of the Leisure Class, was conspicuous consumption. Now, being that, again, I was a BAB, a broke-ass bitch, I didn't have any money for that conspicuousness. So peacocking, as guys do, I did spend a lot of money on clothing because for the rich people I wanted to sit with, I wanted to look as good as they did. So that might have been, I guess, ostentatious in that I had custom-made shirts. But part of it was also because I was an athlete and my neck was too big for the store-bought shirts that otherwise would have fit me. So when I went to the store-bought shirts and I had my arms out, there was so much extra fabric like under my arms here. I looked like a flying squirrel if I put if I stood like Cristo Redentor, Christ the Redeemer in Brazil. I had so much fabric here. It's like Omar the tent maker. So that ended up being fortuitous. But that was like my one big expense, which was a business expense. I wasn't out leasing Ferraris and doing crazy things with my money. Then think about having like, I'll say this and I'll go away. Think about like, don't worry about your per trade rules as much. That's what I did. I kept thinking about, that's not what I did. I thought about how I was going to grow my account and what was the best way to do that, as opposed to worrying about the P&L on any one particular trade. And that was very liberating and very freeing because I knew like, okay, I have to focus on process, not just any one setup. And I couldn't afford to have 3 different setups. There wasn't any time because I was working a day job and I couldn't make it look like I was trading like a banshee because that's not what they hired me for. And in the first 2 years, I was getting a bit of a draw. I was getting a draw, not against my production. I was getting lower payout, but I was getting a salary as I had to pass my licenses and then build my book of business. And that was material because I didn't know how long it was going to take me to learn my craft. And so there was this tricky thing where I was in a job that I didn't particularly like, but it was the only way I could be in the business and use my skills. So I kind of I had really 2 jobs at the same time and I had to excel at both. The financial advisor job I had to excel at so that I could keep my seat at the desk because I wouldn't have been able to open up an account in those days. There wasn't all the online stuff because that didn't exist. And the discount brokerage, it was still way before their time. So to me, it was the evil of 2 lessers, right? I didn't want to be in the damn job, but it fulfilled. I had to do. It was like being stuck in a marriage, and so, obviously, a lot to think about. Lots of moving parts. It's impossible to go back in time, but I know my nature and I know how I think, and I'm a bit of an opportunist. So I think those are some of the things in this ramble here that I would put together and take advantage of, or at least experiment and try. I think a couple big takeaways would be to like focus on one thing, worry about branching out. After you own one particular thing, don't worry about A, B, and C. That again, if you're in a professional training program, that's different. 99% of you are at home doing this by yourself. I would really lock down one thing that you can do over like a 2 to 4 week window of time. And then, because I know that works for most people, think about it. Investors who buy and hold make a lot of money. So if you can keep cutting that time frame down so that you can make as much money in short time, you're being more efficient, right? So keep bringing that down. And then if you can, make money within a week, try to swing trade and make it over a couple of days. And if you can make money as a swing trader, then try to do it intraday. The intraday space is where the majority of failure takes place. So to try to win at that with no training, that's going to be hard. People can do it. I know people who do it, but try to set yourself up to win. This way, you at least have something that you can rely on and say, okay, I know I could make money any given month. I'll say, okay, cool. Now I'm going to cut that in half. Can I make money over a two-week window? And then cut it down to like a week and say, okay, what's my goal? Like my goal is to grow my account, not to win on any one particular trade. And I think if you focus on that, that really cascades all the dominoes at that point. Anyway, if you're new here, thanks for being here. Please like and subscribe. And if you haven't already gotten a copy of the audiobook version of my book, The Inner Voice of Trading, you can get the link in the description. Thanks for being here, folks. I'll see you next time.